The account of Russia's atrocities, human rights violations and ferocious attacks against the innocent civilian population is overwhelming. Children forcibly separated from their families, deported for re-education in order to make them forget their culture and who they are. Entire towns and villages wiped out for no reason. Mass graves and torture chambers in which people just disappear. Sadly, the evidence tells the story better than any statement. The list of stories full of horror is endless. Yet we cannot just passively observe it. This must end. Russia must unconditionally withdraw all troops from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Russia's leaders must be held accountable for the crime of aggression against its neighbor. This is why we have extended our support to the establishment of a special tribunal to prosecute the crime of aggression against Ukraine. It is our duty to ensure that those responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity are held accountable. Apart from violence, injustice, and suffering of civilians, every war also brings destruction. Reconstruction of Ukraine may be the largest rebuilding effort in modern history. We support establishing the register of damage caused by Russian military, and we call on all states to join these efforts. Czechia will support Ukraine in its defense as long as necessary. From day one, we have stood by Ukraine's side and provided the defenders with weapons and ammunition. With the outburst of the Russian aggression against Ukraine, Czechia has also stepped up its support for Russian and Belarusian pro-democratic voices, and Prague has become an important hub for journalists and human rights defenders in need. For over 18 months, Czechia has been providing humanitarian assistance to the war-affected Ukrainian population. Per capita, my country has received more Ukrainian refugees than anybody else, mostly women and children. What Ukrainian people truly deserve is peace. Not just any end of hostilities, but just and durable peace. If it is to be sustainable, it cannot be based on an unjust compromise or conditions imposed by the conqueror. Neither shall it leave hopes for Russia to fulfill its imperial ambitions. It must be peace on terms of the defender and not the aggressor, as early today stated President of Ukraine, Zelensky. Don't forget, the damaging impacts of Russia's aggression are felt across the world. Russia's blockade of Ukrainian ports and destruction of infrastructure and grain continues to weaponize global food security in the most reckless and cynical way. Let me be very clear. Ukraine's security is our own security. From Africa to Europe to Latin America to Asia. I call on leaders of the free world to keep the unity and support of Ukraine. Mr. President, the threats we face are global and interconnected. Because of Russia and a handful of other countries, our world is more dangerous and rougher. Instead of cultivating cooperative security, we have to build up our militaries. Instead of boosting social cohesion programs and overcoming economic insecurity, we have to boost our defense budgets. Those who contest the international rules steer the wheel of global security backwards into confrontation, and sooner or later at the expense of all of us. Russia's reckless threats to use nuclear weapons, its policy of coercion and intimidation, represent a threat to balance and integrity of the whole system of non-proliferation. The announced stationing of nuclear weapons in Belarus is a further irresponsible escalation Czechia condemns in the strongest terms. Unfortunately, Russia's fingerprints can be found in several other current crises. Mr. President, the security, humanitarian and political crises unfolding in Sahel region are more than worrisome. The international community must try to find a way to end the series of military coups and ensure a return to constitutional order. This is the only way countries can effectively protect themselves against terrorism. It is the only way the much-needed economic and social development called for by African people can take place. The region remains vulnerable to numerous political, economic and climate risks. Its long-term stability, security and prosperity is crucial. We must offer genuine, pragmatic partnerships. Some countries pretend to be willing to help. In reality, they create economic and political dependencies. These undermine the long-term stability and manipulate the free will of people by spreading lies and disinformation. In Asia and Pacific, Czechia is an active and reliable ally and partner. The word cooperation must remain key for our joint efforts in the region. We deplore China's military actions which raise tensions in the Taiwan Strait and its unfriendly actions against partners in the South China Sea. Any dispute or contagious issue must be solved peacefully. Any potential armed conflict in the region would have negative consequences for the whole world. In North Korea and Iran, reckless escalation of nuclear or intercontinental ballistic missile activities combined with a lack of transparency threaten international and regional security. The same applies to any material support to Russia's military aggression in Ukraine. It is clear that such supplies only aggravate the suffering of the Ukrainian civilian population. The Middle East remains the world's most volatile region, troubled by spread of conflicts, terrorism, and sectarian violence. Efforts to normalize relations between Israel and its Arab neighbors bring positive steps towards stability and peace in the region. Mr. President, our efforts to maintain peace and security are closely linked with our ability to promote human well-being and sustainable development of our societies. One may ask how a country of 10+ million people can contribute to global ambitions. Having our own national experience with oppression, fundamental rights and freedoms are deeply embedded in our value system and foreign policy. Czechia strives to pursue an active human rights and democracy policy. We are a staunch supporter of international human rights mechanisms. Currently, we are proud to serve as the presidency of the UN Human Rights Council. More than ever, we have to support media freedom to enable access to independent and factual information. Without it, disinformation and propaganda will prevail. Mr. President, the Sustainable Development Goals Summit yesterday sent a strong message of urgency and determination. The 2030 Agenda is a promise to current and future generations which we have to keep. There is an urgent need to highlight the link between peace, security, climate, environment and development on one hand, and human rights, justice and strong institutions on the other. In the latest SDGs index, Czechia is ranked as the 8th most advanced country in the implementation of the Agenda 2030 and its SDGs. Yet we also face many challenges and we need to step up our efforts. Climate change remains the single most destructive threat to the current and future existence and well-being of all humankind. It threatens our lives, livelihoods, food security, prosperity, and ultimately peace and security worldwide. Czechs devote a lot of attention to this issue. It is no coincidence that it was under the Czech presidency of the Council of the European Union last year that we finalized crucial legislation which shows the path towards the green transition of our industry. 30 years after the end of the Cold War, we are witnessing efforts of authoritarian regimes to redefine core principles of multilateral order. Malign actors use cyberspace, disinformation, economic, political and other tools to disrupt democratic processes, to undermine our institutions and to weaken our security. The challenges we face today are significant, and it is apparent that only collective action can ensure a safe and prosperous future for all. In this respect, Czechia recognizes its global responsibility and remains committed to ensuring that no one is left behind. I personally commit to work with the international community to fulfill urgent work that must be done. All the best to you and thank you for your attention.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale,
on behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of Czechia for the statement just delivered, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will now hear an address by His Excellency Sir Angel Whips, President of the Republic of Palau. I request protocol to escort His Excellency.
au nom de l'Assemblée générale,
On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Sir Angel Whips, President of the Republic of Palau, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
President Dennis Francis, Secretary General Antonio Gutierrez, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Ali, and warm greetings from the people of Palau. President Francis, congratulations on your election. As a fellow islander, you are well aware and acquainted with the common challenges that SIDS face, from economic resilience and climate change to financing and security. We all look forward to working with you over the next year to meet these challenges. Secretary General Gutierrez, we thank you again for your tireless efforts and advocacy for a more secure, prosperous, and sustainable world, which is our ultimate goal and what brings us here today. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is a universal call to action. As a small island developing state, Palau faces economic challenges related to our small population. We are vulnerable to climate change, and we struggle with the high cost of imported foods and goods, and face infrastructure challenges due to our remote location. These shared issues highlight the unique challenges faced by SIDS in our pursuit of sustainable development and a better life for our people. Mr. President, like other SIDS, Palau is working to build a diverse and resilient economy. We are looking to the digital world, which doesn't rely on land mass, but on our determination to succeed. The new perspective is born out of a harsh lesson learned when punches started coming about 7 years ago. In 2016, Palau's economy, heavily dependent on tourism, had a significant downturn. When first, in 1 year, we lost 13% of our tourism. And by 2019, these numbers had dropped by 47%. And in fact, when COVID-19 hit and in 2021, that number had reduced to 3,400 visitors, or we lost 98% of our tourism numbers since 2015. Mr. President, I share these figures to underscore the susceptibility of external influences and the profound impact they have on our national economy. Already suffering from the drop in tourism, Palau was hit hard by the worldwide delay of goods caused by the pandemic. Factories shut down and logistical challenges led to delays in the delivery of equipment and supplies. Prices soared, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine further aggravated the situation, causing gas prices to skyrocket. The economic downturn experienced by Palau underscores the interconnectedness of our global community. If tourism challenges and COVID-19 were the 1-2 punch, the inflated cost of goods could have very well knocked us out. Luckily, we had the help and support of partners. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia, although geographically distant, had a ripple effect that led to high inflation and prices in Palau. This situation raises the importance of security and how destabilizing conflict can be to world order. There are Palauans today who survived a war that was not of their own making, only to suffer the ripple effects of another. Current events serve as a stark reminder of the urgent need for peace and stability worldwide. We unequivocally condemn Russia's invasion of Ukraine and call for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Similarly, we urge the United Nations and all parties involved in the Taiwan Straits to exercise restraint and seek a peaceful resolution to reduce tensions. The well-being and prosperity of nations and their economies are intrinsically linked to global peace and stability. For the last 2 years, we have been striving to build a resilient economy amidst external pressure. A significant challenge has been outmigration. Since 1994, when we gained our independence, nearly half our population has left and seeking new opportunities outside and beyond our shores. The brain drain has not only reduced local capacity, but has hindered growth. We are grateful to partner nations, including the United States, Japan, Taiwan, and Australia, and others that provide assistance in training capacity to upskill our local population as well. And we are encouraged by discussions to promote economic investments and potentially create job opportunities that can help discourage outmigration and promote economic growth. Climate change is the most significant challenge to our progress toward achieving sustainable development. The impacts are evident in our coastal areas, agricultural lands, marine resources, and cultural heritage, and most importantly, our livelihoods. Assisting in mitigating and adapting to these impacts is crucial for our continued progress and survival. In my youth, I'd spearfish on the reef with my father, helping to provide for our family. There was one remote island in Palau, southern waters, where we would go. It was alive with birds, turtles, and fish and clams. Recently, I revisited this island with my children, witnessing turtles laying their eggs. The island had diminished in size by 2/3 due to sea level rise. And sadly, half the turtles' eggs that were laid that night were in the tidal zone and unlikely to survive. This heart-wrenching reality mirrors the fate of our homes and cultures if we fail to take decisive action. We urgently call on the G20 nations, responsible for 80% of global carbon emissions, to uphold their commitments to the Paris Agreement and limit warming to 1.5 degrees. This is crucial to mitigate the climate change impacts like disappearing islands and unhatched turtle eggs. As major emitters, the G20 nations have a crucial role to play in emission reduction and leading the path towards sustainable development. We urge the UN to simplify access to multilateral funds for SIDS and other vulnerable communities. Promoting faster transition, we call on the international community to work with the SIDS to increase access to climate finance. And we believe it's time that we change the metrics we use to determine how we access these funds by using a better index, a multi-vulnerability index, to determine how we help. However, we must ensure that commitments pledged here are acted upon and not forgotten. We have a saying in Palau that goes, Ngora terbesel adao. Let's not be like the foam riding on the waves of the ocean, drifting without settling. This Palauan saying refers to meetings where much is said, but afterwards no action is taken. Despite these challenges, we acknowledge progress that has been made. COP26 in Glasgow, COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh were successful in leading to green domestic policies in some of the world's largest economies. And we appreciate the support of nations opposing and putting a moratorium on deep-sea mining. Proponents argue seabed minerals aid renewable transition. But the reality is we lack the knowledge about the potential impacts on the underwater ecosystems this devastating action could have. Disturbing the ocean bed, we know, could release stored carbon dioxide, which directly contradicts with our efforts to combat climate change. We advocate for a global deep-sea mining moratorium and adhering to the UN Convention on the Law of the Seas precautionary principle. On a positive note, Palau will sign the BB&J instrument tomorrow. Universal participation is crucial, especially from developed countries that can provide the implementation means and engage in areas beyond national jurisdiction activities. This movement signifies global unity in protecting the high seas biodiversity. Palau also would like to take this opportunity and second President Biden's call for the Security Council's reform. We believe such reform would introduce fresh perspectives and allow nations like Japan a permanent seat in the Council, which has seen little change since its establishment in 1945. We propose considering the abolishment of the veto powers, which can obstruct effective UN action. The upcoming summit of the future in 2024 and the 80th anniversary of the United Nations in 2025 present fitting opportunities to demonstrate progress in the Security Council. We also advocate for change regarding the Republic of China's Taiwan unjustly excluded from the UN processes. Despite its remarkable leadership and innovative solutions, Taiwan has collaborated with Palau on many vital issues, such as tourism, agriculture, ocean conservation, climate, gender equality, education, and innovation. And we urge the UN to allow Taiwan's meaningful participation in crucial specialized agencies and processes like the WHO, ICAO, and the UNFCCC. Taiwan's 23 million people have much to offer to the world, and the UN Charter affirms the equal rights of all peoples and nations, and we urge the UN to uphold the vision by allowing Taiwan to participate and contribute. Our world is under siege from war and climate change and threats that undermine sustainable development and have driven many into poverty. The Ukraine crisis exemplifies this, with lives lost, property destroyed, and essential supplies disrupted. These crises are not distant threats, but harsh realities affecting millions, including those in the Pacific Islands. We must act now to improve life across our shared ocean and world. The Palauan story of Tebang, a son, teaches us about unity. Tebang and his friends went to the forest to fell a large tree to be carved into a canoe. Unfortunately, the log ended up in a taro swamp. Unable to move it, Tebang went home to consult his father, who gave him a chant. He returned with all his friends, and together chanting "It can move," or we like to say "It can move," they began pulling in unison, which allowed the log to be pulled from the swamp to the shoreline to be carved into a canoe. Just as Tebang and his friends moved the log, we too can move mountains if we speak and act together. Our task may be daunting, but remember, it can move. We can move towards a sustainable future where our grandchildren can breathe clean air, swim in pristine seas, live in peace, and prosper. So let's raise our voices together and chant "Ikamu." Let's move this world toward a better tomorrow. Together, we are unstoppable. Together, we can ensure a thriving planet for generations to come. Let's seize this moment with unity and determination. Let's unite for a better tomorrow, because together, we can move. We are truly stronger together. Sulang, thank you, and God bless you all.
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Palau for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Mr. Macky Sall, President of the Republic of Senegal. I request protocol to escort His Excellency. On behalf of the General Assembly, I have the honor to welcome His Excellency Macky Sall, President of the Republic of Senegal, and to invite him to address the Assembly.
Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President, President of the General Assembly, dear colleagues, Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates. President, on behalf of Senegal, I wish you every success as you preside over the work of the General Assembly. I thank your predecessor, and I renew our support to the Secretary General as he carries out his work in the service of this organization. Since our last session, the state of the world has not improved. For millions of people, daily life is one of fear, violence, poverty, and inequalities. Many countries continue to suffer from the economic and social impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. Climate change has reached an unprecedented level. The tragedy of illicit migration reminds us of the need to implement the Global Compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration, and to continue to combat the criminal networks that are organizing this illicit traffic in human beings. A high-intensity war is leading to humanity standing at the risk of a major disaster. In Africa, the resurgence of coups d'etat remain a subject of grave concern. Senegal reiterates its firm condemnation of any type of anti-constitutional government change. The current emergency is also that of terrorism, which continues to gain ground in Africa without appropriate action taken by the Security Council. Particularly during its mandate in the Council in 2016 and 2017, Senegal has repeatedly raised the inefficiency of the peacekeeping operations in Africa, whose mandates and equipment are not in line with the current situations. There is no peace to maintain where the peace needs to be restored. Armed groups need to be fought. Those who are pillaging and attacking innocent populations every day. They're occupying entire territories and threatening states. They're threatening the very existence of states. The tumultuous history of two current peacekeeping missions in Africa are quite telling when it comes to this. And therefore, Senegal, once again, calls on the Security Council to fully assume its responsibilities in combating terrorism in Africa under the mechanism of collective security as envisaged in the Charter. In the same spirit, we call for de-escalation and a peaceful settlement to the war in Ukraine. We renew our support to the right of the Palestinian people for a state that is living coexisting peacefully with the State of Israel, both within their safe and internationally recognized borders. Mr. President, the theme of this session reminds us that the ideal at the very foundation of multilateralism is to create and promote confident and inclusive relations between countries, relations that are created in solidarity. Senegal recognizes the significant services that the UN system and that of Bretton Woods has been giving to its member states for almost 80 years now. But we all know that the multilateral system is the heritage of our past, and now it is obsolete. As was rightly said by the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, a system that continues to ignore the realities of its time and the needs of more than 3/4 of its members highlights the inequalities, generates the conditions for this system to be contested, and provokes a risk that it may fragment. If we want to avoid this fragmentation, wisdoms would tell us that we need to reform political, economic, and financial governance at the global level. It must be more just, more representative of the diversity, and thus reaffirm its legitimacy. We can do so if we devote the necessary political will to it. The G20 showed this by admitting the African Union as a full member. I warmly thank the members of the G20 for their unanimous support to this initiative, which Senegal had proposed while it was presiding over the African Union. We hope that this example of inclusion given by the G20 will be followed by the Security Council and the Bretton Woods institutions for a multilateralism that is more representative of the interests of all its members. In the same vein, Senegal remains committed to the vision of peaceful international relations based on the equal dignity of peoples, cultures, and civilizations. On the 31st of October, 1961, 1 year after the independence of our country, President Leopold Sédar Senghor expressed this vision using these words: "A particular civilization cannot be established without causing the majority of humanity to rise up against it." 62 years later, our position remains the same. Between free peoples, where the socio-cultural realities and history are diverse, there cannot be any legitimacy for some to define and force a single way of living upon all. For example, some sort of one-size-fits-all civilization. What works for some does not necessarily work for others. Together, we can practice our common values, but also together, we must respect our differences. This, for Senegal, is what must be the foundation of a revitalized universalism, one that is more open, more effective in addressing the challenges of our time. And amongst these challenges is the climate crisis. Extreme phenomena are multiplying. Senegal remains committed in the implementation of the Paris Accord on climate change. And through our willing policies when it comes to energy mixes and renewable energies now represent 31% of our electricity. With the signature last June of our Partnership for a Just Energy Transition, our ambition is to raise this rate to 40% by 2030. And here I thank the partner countries that have supported us in the mobilization of 2.5 billion euros over an initial period of 3 to 5 years, beginning in 2023, to finance our projects under this partnership. At the same time, we will continue the completion of carbon neutral infrastructure, those that are resilient to climate change. These include 2 projects of mass transport, a regional express train, and a rapid transit bus line, both of which will be electric. With the implementation of our national and continental projects under the Great Green Wall, our countries are clearly committed to climate action in line with their means available. Green projects in Africa are financed through commercial debt, but they should be supported by the mobilization of $100 billion a year as established during COP15 in 2009 to finance climate action. Climate justice would mean that the continent that contributes less than 4% of emissions and that suffers the most should not be condemned to become indebted to repair and prevent the damage that it is not responsible for. Senegal is in favor of just, equitable energy transitions, those that take into account the specific needs of our countries, including universal access to electricity, something that more than 600 million Africans are still without. Thus, if we want COP28 to be a meeting of promises that were kept, we must ensure that the announced financing be available and accessible through simplified and transparent procedures and modalities. Mr. President, dear friends, on the 25th of February 2024 will be the date of the Senegalese presidential election. Like those that have come before, it will be democratic, free, and transparent. And the 2nd of April, I will pass the power to my successor after 12 years at the head of our country. I would like to thank the member countries of our organization for their friendship and their cooperation. Being the voice of Senegal, creating and maintaining friendships in this Assembly of Nations, where our common efforts are towards our common goals, was a great honor for me. On behalf of the people of Senegal, I wish to express my gratitude to all my colleagues, and I ask them to welcome my successor with the same friendship and the same consideration. I will keep the same feelings of friendship and cordial respect for you all. I am confident that the Senegalese tradition of openness and dialogue will be that of my successor as he remains committed to the trusting friendships that unite our country and all the members of the United Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your kind attention.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale,
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the President of the Republic of Senegal for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Mr. Olaf Scholz, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. I request protocol to escort His Excellency.
j'ai le plaisir
I have the pleasure to welcome His Excellency Mr. Olaf Scholz, Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. I invite him to address the Assembly.
Herr Präsident,
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, 50 years ago, almost to the day, 2 German states joined the United Nations. The then German Democratic Republic as the 133rd member, and the Federal Republic of Germany as the 134th member. This step is of great importance to us Germans to this very day, for membership of the United Nations enabled my country, the instigator of terrible wars and horrific crimes, to return to the family of peace-loving nations. We're profoundly grateful for this chance. This return was not free of requirements. The accession of the two German states was preceded by a visionary policy of détente. The aim, as my predecessor, Federal Chancellor and Nobel Peace Prize laureate Willy Brandt, said here in New York 50 years ago, was to fill in the rift of the Cold War. Three things were essential for this. First of all, the clear commitment of both German states to resolve conflicts without force. This was laid down in the basic treaty between Bonn and East Berlin, as well as in the treaties which the Federal Republic of Germany concluded with its eastern neighbors. The second prerequisite was the renunciation of any form of revisionism by recognizing Germany's new borders drawn after the Second World War as inviolable. At the time, many people in West Germany were opposed to this. In retrospect, however, it proved to be the right decision. Finally, the third prerequisite was a foreign policy that did not ignore the realities of the Cold War and which, at the same time, always remained focused on overcoming the status quo, that is to say, the confrontation between the blocs and thus also the unnatural division of Germany. When I look back here today at the beginnings of our membership of the United Nations, I'm doing so not only out of historical interest. Rather, it is because the prohibition of the use of force still remains the unfulfilled core pledge of our United Nations. Because the inviolability of borders and the sovereign equality of states also have to be defended in our multipolar world by us all. And because we today, especially today, need the courage, creative energy, and will to fill in the rifts which are deeper than ever. Germany is strongly committed to these three ideals: the renunciation of the use of force as a political instrument, the rejection of any kind of revisionism, and the determination to engage in cooperation beyond any dividing factors. It is to these ideals that we Germans owe the great fortune of living in a unified country today, in peace with our neighbors, friends, and partners around the world. At the same time, what Willy Brandt stated here 50 years ago is all the more true today. In a world in which we are increasingly dependent on each other, a policy for peace must not stop on our own doorstep. German policy can and never will be limited to pursuing our interests with no consideration for others, because we know that our freedom, our democracy, and our prosperity are deeply rooted in the well-being of Europe and the world. That is why the order of the day is not less cooperation, perhaps packaged today as decoupling or as cooperation only among the like-minded. Instead, we need more cooperation. Existing alliances must be strengthened and new partners sought. For this is the only way to reduce the risks of excessively one-sided dependencies. This is all the more true in a world which, in contrast to 50 years ago, no longer has only two centers of power. Rather, it has many. Multipolarity is not a new order. Anyone who assumes that smaller countries are the backyard of larger ones is mistaken. Multipolarity is not a normative category, but a description of today's reality. Anyone seeking order in a multipolar world has to start here at the United Nations. That is why Germany supports the UN system and, as the second largest contributor after the United States, pays its regular budget assessment with full conviction. Only the United Nations, on the basis of the values enshrined in its charter, can fully realize the aspirations of universal representation and sovereign equality for all. That cannot be said of either the G7 or the G20, as important as they are for achieving international consensus, or of BRICS or other groups. I know that some will counter by asking, is the United Nations not all too often unable to take action, paralyzed by the antagonisms of its heterogeneous membership? My response to them is, the obstruction of a few, no matter how influential they are, should not lead us to forget that we, the overwhelming majority of states, agree on many things. All of us, almost all of us, want force as a political instrument to remain banned. All of us have an interest in ensuring that the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of our countries are respected. And all of us should know what this requires, namely, that we also grant others these rights. These golden rules are universal, even if many of us were not yet sitting around the table when the UN Charter was adopted in 1945. Yet, only 10 years later in Bandung, Indonesia, it was the African and Asian states liberated from colonialism that raised their voices to call for self-determination, territorial integrity, the sovereign equality of all states, and a world without colonialism and imperialism. This seems more relevant today than ever before. It is by these principles that we, whether large or small, will all be judged. These principles must also form the basis when it comes to reshaping our multipolar world. Only then can the global challenges of our time can be mastered. The greatest challenge of all is anthropogenic climate change. Of course, the traditional industrialized countries have a special responsibility in the fight against the climate crisis. However, many other countries are among the biggest emitters today. Instead of waiting for others, we all have to do more together to achieve the Paris climate goals. Each and every one of us must have the opportunity to gain the same level of prosperity as people in Europe, North America, or in countries such as Japan or Australia. However, our planet will not survive if this economic development is attained with the technologies and production processes of the 19th or 20th centuries with combustion engines and coal-fired power plants. This leads us to one conclusion. We have to decouple economic development from CO2 emissions. This is already happening in many countries, for we have the solutions and technologies. As a key nation in the field of technology, we are offering to cooperate here for the common good. If producers of renewable energies and their industrial users come together across continents, we will create new prosperity together in many places around the world. And I'm pleased to announce to you today that Germany is honoring its pledges on international climate financing. From 2 billion euro in 2014 and then more than 4 billion euro in 2020, we tripled our contribution last year to 6 billion euro. We have therefore kept our word, as will the industrialized countries as a whole, which will hit their target of 100 billion euro for international climate financing for the first time this year. That is an important and overdue signal before we take stock in Dubai this December and negotiate new climate action plans for the period after 2030. I believe it is important that we are as concrete and as binding as possible. That is why I advocate that we set clear targets in Dubai for the expansion of renewable energies and for greater energy efficiency. We will be equally ambitious when it comes to achieving the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Climate action or development, this trade-off will not work. Our summit yesterday brought home to me how urgent it is that we make up for lost time when it comes to the SDGs too. We therefore want to use next year's Summit of the Future, which we're currently preparing with our friends from Namibia, to pick up the pace and push ahead with the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. It is important to me in this context that we ensure more private investment in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Let me just give you one example. The entire world is currently talking about the diversification of supply chains and raw material security. Would it not be a start if at least the first production step were to take place on site, where the raw material deposits are to be found? Certainly, Germany and German business are open to entering into partnerships of this very nature. Of course, in the coming years, we will all face the challenge of leading our economies, our energy supplies, and our infrastructure to a resource-efficient, climate-neutral future. This will require major investment. To create the right conditions to bring about this investment, we have to address the debt crisis in many countries and modernize the international financial architecture. I said it at the start that Germany is not clinging on to the status quo, not in this issue either. We want something to change. I have been calling most recently at the G20 summit in Delhi for the multilateral development banks to reform so that they can contribute more to financing the protection of global public goods, such as the climate and biodiversity or the prevention of pandemics. That is what the G20 decided in Delhi. Germany is also providing financial support for this reform. We will be the first country to invest hybrid capital to the tune of 305 million euro in the World Bank. It is estimated that this capital will enable the World Bank to provide more than 2 billion euro in additional loans. Ladies and gentlemen, General Secretary Guterres pointed out to the rapidly increasing demand and humanitarian needs faced with the many crises worldwide. Germany is the second largest donor of humanitarian assistance around the globe, and we will continue to stand by the people who need it most. And our United Nations itself must not cling to the status quo, ladies and gentlemen, and by that I mean two things. Firstly, the United Nations must tackle the challenges of the future, just as Secretary General Antonio Guterres has proposed. One of the major issues, in my view, is how we can ensure that innovation and technological advances can be used by humanity as a whole. Artificial intelligence, for example, offers tremendous opportunities, and at the same time, it can cement the division of the world if only a few benefit from it, if algorithms only take into account part of the reality, if access is limited to richer countries. That is why Germany is actively fostering the exchange on the global digital compact. We should also talk about common rules for the possible use of generative artificial intelligence as a weapon. Another question that will define our future is how the United Nations itself represents the reality of a multipolar world. To date, it does not do that sufficiently. That is most evident in the composition of the Security Council. I am therefore delighted that a growing number of partners, including 3 of the permanent members, have stated that they want to see progress on reform. However, one thing is clear: Africa deserves greater representation, as do Asia and Latin America. Under this premise, we can negotiate a text with various options. No country should obstruct these open-ended negotiations with excessively high demands. Germany will not do that either. Ultimately, it is up to the General Assembly to decide on a reform of the Security Council. Until then, Germany would like to shoulder responsibility as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, and I ask you to support our candidacy for the years 2027-2028. Ladies and gentlemen, when I speak these days before this Assembly of Peace, then my thoughts are with those for whom peace is a distant dream. My thoughts are with the Sudanese who have become victims of a brutal power struggle between two warlords, with the men and women in eastern Congo and, as we speak, the people in Nagorno-Karabakh. The renewed military activities lead into a dead end they need to end. And of course, my thoughts are with the Ukrainians who are fighting for their lives and their freedom, for independence and their country's territorial integrity, in order to safeguard those very principles to which we all committed ourselves in the UN Charter. But Russia's war of aggression has caused immense suffering not only in Ukraine. People around the world are suffering as a result of inflation, growing debts, the scarcity of fertilizers, hunger, and increasing poverty. Precisely because this war is having unbearable consequences around the world, it is right and proper that the world is involved in the quest for the peace. And at the same time, we should beware of phony solutions which represent peace in name only. For peace without freedom is called oppression. Peace without justice is called dictatorship. Moscow, too, must finally understand that. For let us not forget that Russia is responsible for this war, and it is Russia's president who can end it at any time with one single order. But for him to do that, he has to understand that we, the states of the United Nations, are serious about our principles. That in the multipolar world of the 21st century, we do not see a place for revisionism and imperialism. No one here in New York has expressed this as aptly as our colleague, the ambassador of Kenya. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, he said this in the Security Council.
Rather than form nations that looked ever backward in history with a dangerous nostalgia, we choose to look forward to a greatness none of our many nations and people had ever known. Fellow delegates, Germany's history holds many lessons about the dangers of such nostalgia. That is why we choose a different path when we joined the United Nations 50 years ago. The path of peace and reconciliation, the path of recognizing existing borders, the path of cooperation with all of you in the pursuit of a better and more equitable world. It started with a solemn promise that we made 50 years ago. A promise every one of us made upon joining the United Nations, namely, to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security. Let us all do our best to live up to that promise. Vielen Dank.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale,
On behalf of the General Assembly, I wish to thank the Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany for the statement just made, and I request protocol to escort His Excellency. The Assembly will hear an address by His Excellency Mr. Kishida Fumio, Prime Minister of Japan. I request protocol to escort His Excellency.
j'ai le plaisir de
I have great pleasure in welcoming His Excellency Kishida Fumio, Prime Minister of Japan. I invite him to address the Assembly.
Mr. President, Excellencies, now we have gathered in New York once again. The SDGs are at their midpoint, facing mounting obstacles. And to our dismay, the aggression against Ukraine has yet to cease. This year, as the world stands at a historical inflection point, Japan serves as a non-permanent member of the Security Council and the presidency of the G7. In those capacities, I have heard the desperate desire for peace and the pleas of vulnerable people seeking help. We should respond to these voices and work towards a world filled with cooperation and not division and confrontation. This is my message to all the leaders of the member states. In our common agenda, Secretary General Guterres called for international solidarity. Let us renew our commitment to a strong and effective multilateralism with the United Nations at its core. Mr. President, the world faces complex and interrelated issues ranging from climate change, infectious diseases, to challenges to the rule of law. Now, at a time when international cooperation is in want more than ever, we cannot overcome these difficulties if the international community remains divided over ideologies or values. That is why I believe we should go back to the very basic foundation of treating human life and dignity with paramount importance. We should aim for a world caring for human dignity where vulnerable people can live safely and securely. At a time when the international community is facing multiple crises and increasingly being divided, we need a common language which resonates with all of us. By shedding new light on human dignity, I believe the international community can overcome differences in regimes or values and steadily advance human-centered international cooperation. Japan has led human-centered international cooperation based on the concept of human security. With this approach, we need to accelerate the efforts among the international community to achieve the SDGs. The dignity of the individual must not be neglected as states and the international community tackle global challenges. To overcome inequalities and achieve the SDGs, quality growth and sustainable growth are essential. The key is to invest in people, which is my political credo. Gender perspective is also important for quality growth. Japan aims to reduce inequalities and overcome social divisions by promoting women's participation. Japan will promote transparent and fair development finance in accordance with international rules to achieve sustainable growth in developing countries. Private finance will also be tapped to fill the gap of development finance. Japan will work with other countries to find ways to manage economies that protect human dignity while attracting investment dynamism. Mr. President, in order to address unprecedented crises and challenges and to protect and strengthen human dignity, let us start step by step from where we can. The first is cooperation towards the realization of a peaceful and stable international community where human dignity is respected. Hailing from Hiroshima, which was devastated by atomic bombing, I have made nuclear disarmament my lifelong mission. Towards achieving a world without nuclear weapons, we will continue to bolster realistic and practical efforts while upholding and strengthening the NPT by implementing measures under the Hiroshima Action Plan. I call on political leaders of nuclear weapon states and other countries around the globe to step up their engagement on nuclear disarmament so that those from all walks of life are exposed to its importance and take concrete action, not despite of, but because of the challenging security environment. With a view to working towards a world without nuclear weapons, which we have been striving for, together with the Hibakshas, victims of atomic bombings, we must crystallize the nuclear disarmament trend, which has been successfully mainstreamed thanks to the efforts of our predecessors. As we speak, we are faced with the threat of the reversal of the downward trend of the global number of nuclear weapons. The significance of a treaty banning the production of fissile material for nuclear weapons or other explosive devices, FMCT, which was avowed here in the General Assembly 30 years ago, has not diminished by any measure. That is why I just co-hosted a high-level event on FMCT with the Philippines and Australia to refocus political attention towards the FMCT on the 30th year of its initial proposal. Having nuclear weapon states engage in concrete nuclear disarmament measures is key. Japan, as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, will work with the UN and relevant states to promote dialogue between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. To set in stone the trend of mainstreaming nuclear disarmament, it is paramount to transcend purely government efforts and engage in multi-layered efforts to overcome the divisive debate among academia and government over whether we should be choosing deterrence or disarmament. Japan will contribute 3 billion yen to newly establish Japan Chair for a World Without Nuclear Weapons at overseas research institutes and think tanks. By using the Youth Non-Nuclear Leader Fund, Youth Leader Fund for a World Without Nuclear Weapons, which I established last year in cooperation with the United Nations, we will continue to build a global network of young people for nuclear abolition.
It is also essential to ensure nuclear safety and the security of nuclear materials and facilities, including in situations of conflict. We also need to defend the dignity of people jeopardized by armed conflicts. Russia's aggression against Ukraine continues. A food crisis must not be perpetuated. Supporting vulnerable people in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere is essential. We need to protect the safety of women and children, who are the most vulnerable in conflict situations, to strengthen border controls and measures against trafficking in person, as well as to provide international support to retrieve abducted children. Women, Peace and Security. WPS places women as crucial and active players in relevant policies for peace and security, and Japan will continue to promote this agenda.
第2に
The second is how to take a balance between the progress of digitalization and human dignity. Digitalization is bringing benefits to everybody. However, there are risks of privacy and human rights violations. We need a digital ecosystem and international rules that are compatible with human dignity. That is why at the G7 Hiroshima Summit, we launched the Hiroshima AI process on generative AI towards trustworthy AI. Japan will also strengthen our support for digitalization in developing countries while ensuring cybersecurity.
Third, Japan will work to mitigate the potential impact on people which may arise before net zero is achieved. Asian countries are the key to globally achieving net zero. Under the Asia Zero Emission Community Initiative, Japan will promote effective cooperation taking into account various needs. Japan will further support disaster risk reduction for countries vulnerable to climate change, including island states, aiding efforts towards resilient economies and societies against sea level rise and natural disasters associated with extreme weather events. The ocean is a new frontier with abundant potential, and it is essential to take comprehensive measures, including making use of blue carbon to tackle climate change. The perspective of international law is also important. Japan supports the preservation of existing baselines under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, even after the future regression of the coastline due to the sea level rise. As the G7 presidency, we have set a framework for cooperation on biodiversity conservation and a target of reducing additional plastic pollution to zero by 2040. Japan will continue to contribute in the field of environmental protection. Fourth, we must prepare for the next infectious disease outbreak. We must be ready for the next infectious disease, learning from the lessons through the fight against COVID-19. As the G7, both the public and private sectors have pledged more than $48 billion to achieve universal health coverage and to strengthen prevention, preparedness, and response to health crisis. Japan will contribute $7.5 billion for the period of 2022 through 2025. Together with the mobilization of domestic financial resources, Japan supports mobilizing financial resources in the private sector through the promotion of impact investment. Japan will continue to work with developing countries, including emerging economies, to ensure equitable access to medical countermeasures for health emergencies, MCMs, based on the G20 outcomes. Mr. President, at a time when the world is at a historical inflection point, we must reflect on how we started here. Inscribed in the Charter of the United Nations is the firm determination of our predecessors after the experience of 2 world wars to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and to protect human dignity. The principles of the UN Charter, such as sovereign equality, respect for territorial integrity, and the prohibition of the use of force, are fundamental principles of international law for people to live in peace and provide the basis of the rule of law. International law is there for the benefit of weaker states. Together, under the rule of law, Japan would like to protect the right of vulnerable nations and people to live in peace in order to safeguard and strengthen human dignity. However, even to this day, Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, is infringing upon international law and the rule of law. Unilateral changes to the status quo by force or coercion are unacceptable anywhere in the world. The situation which the General Assembly has repeatedly condemned as a violation of the UN Charter and human rights must be rectified as soon as possible, and the nuclear threat must be ended. In March of this year, I announced a new plan for FOIP, a free and open Indo-Pacific. Based on the principles of freedom, the rule of law, inclusiveness, openness, and diversity, Japan will work with countries that share a vision of a world where diverse nations coexist and prosper together. Japan will further extend our support for peacekeepers. Japan will strengthen the scope and quality of the UN Triangular Partnership Program with an additional contribution of around $9 billion to support around $9 million to support the capacity building of personnel deployed in AUP support operations. Japan's policy on North Korea remains unchanged. Japan seeks to normalize the relationship with North Korea in accordance with the Japan DPRK Pyongyang Declaration through comprehensively resolving the outstanding issues of concern such as abductions, nuclear and missile issues, as well as the settlement of our unfortunate past. From the perspective of opening up a new era together, I would like to convey my determination to meet with President Kim Jong-un face-to-face at any time without any conditions, and would like to hold high-level talks under my direct supervision to realize a summit meeting at an early time. Mr. President, the United Nations should be a place of listening to the voices of people facing difficulties, empowering them, and overcoming such difficulties through cooperation. It should not be a place of confrontation, division. This year, we have agreed on concrete measures to strengthen the structures that support the President of the General Assembly. This is a steady step towards a United Nations for a cooperation. We commend the Secretary General's leadership with his vision for multilateralism. Initiatives to limit the use of veto, which exacerbates division and confrontation in the United Nations, will strengthen and restore confidence in the Security Council. Japan will also continue its efforts to increase the transparency of discussions in the Security Council, including by improving access to deliberations in the Security Council for member states other than the permanent members. To this end, Japan will contribute to the clarification of the rules of the Security Council. The world is changing dramatically. We need a Security Council that reflects the world today. Japan supports increased representation of Africa and the need to expand both the permanent and the non-permanent membership of the Council. Looking ahead to next year's Summit of the Future and the subsequent 80th anniversary of the United Nations, now is the opportunity to move to concrete action. Mr. President, international cooperation that protects and strengthens human dignity will be the driving force that brings the world back towards the same goal. I am looking forward to deepening this discussion at next year's Summit of the Future with future generations in mind. And as we envision the post-2030 agenda in the future, I believe human dignity should be placed as the core principle that illuminates the future of the international community. Let us join our forces to strengthen human dignity and create a United Nations for cooperation. Thank you for your attention.
Au nom de l'Assemblée générale,
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the Prime Minister of Japan for the statement just made, and I request the protocol to escort His Excellency. We have heard the last speaker in the general debate for this evening. We will continue the general debate tomorrow in this hall at 9 a.m. The meeting is adjourned.
powers they have. Imagine even if a governor talks to you anyhow. If you had the Oba and you had power back in the day, that night he will find rain in his room. Or he will find also crippled. You bring your offer. He himself, next time when he sees you, he will respect himself. Because imagine if Boston had gone to bed and now found scorpions on his bed. That these Obas had come together and thrown scorpions on his bed. We will not make this mistake again. So all our powers
now, they are not Christians and Muslims.
So the powers now, powers they had. You don't have it anymore.